the bill.
Nazis are all dead. You can...
American!
Never mind.
Are all your loans in order?
Fashion Police Squad is a first-person shooter developed by Mopeful Games that looks and plays like a colourful Doom mod, replacing blood and demons with stitches and fashion crimes, bringing a whole new meaning to the phrase rip and tear.
Fabulous!
I've seen the game described online as a humour shooter, and I think that kind of encapsulates the tone perfectly. Plus, it's all about a good time, not a long time, and right around the point the novelty starts to wear off, and yeah, it does wear off, the whole thing comes to an end at roughly the 5 to 6 hour mark. The general vibe is also much more lighthearted and jovial than certain other indie shooters out at the moment, most of which involved rain-soaked dystopian futures and a bunch of gritty environments. Now, I'm not trying to say that those kind of games are bad. I mean, I've sure played enough of them by this point. It's kind of nice to play something which feels a bit more wholesome in tone. You know, the kind of thing you could show to an elderly grandmother or your parole officer. Each level ends with a runway sequence, which also kind of serves as the stat screen. And if you've ever wanted to see what the polar opposite is of those old end-level stat screens, well, then this is it right here. And it's just come out on Steam a few days ago with barely anyone talking about it. Well, let's try to fix that, shall we? First things first, what's the whole thing about? Well, I'm so glad you asked. In Fashion Police Squad, you're an officer in the city of Trendopolis. And just think of yourself as the Judge Dredd of the fashion world, upholding the laws of good taste, and just like Dredd, you're also judge, jury, and executioner.
How do you plead?
Not guilty?
Rob Schneider,
However, you won't be shooting people with armor-piercing rounds or double whammies. Instead, you're handing out sentences against people wearing dull suits, baggy suits, bright-coloured clothing, and well, to be honest, pretty much anything.
I was rooting for you! We were all rooting for you! How dare you!
Kinda seems the criteria for what counts as appropriate attire in this city is pretty damn strict. The worst offenders of all, though, being the fat, middle-aged dudes walking around in bright budgie smugglers. And look, coming from someone who lives in a country where our former Prime Minister would often brazenly strut around in a pair of these things, I know all too well the horrors associated with this item of clothing.
Is it?
It's called the Fruit Salad - Tropic Thunder combo.
Of course it is, yeah.
You can't unsee that.
Visually, I think the whole thing looks sharp and appealing. It's got a neat mix of 2D sprites with 3D environments. And I think the sprite work is good enough for the most part, but there are a few enemy types here and there that definitely lack a bit of detail. It's just kind of in contrast to how good some of the backdrops look. Still though, it's kind of hard to fault considering it's been made by the amount of people you can count on one well-manicured hand.
Hang in there, JB. Ah!
You freaking idiot!
This is also a game that really seems to wear its influences on its finely hemmed sleeves. Knowing the fact right from the get-go what the acronym for Fashion Police Squad is, you've got blatant references to games like Doom Eternal and Shadow Warrior. Before fighting Hugo Baus, yes, that's really his name, you can hear the guy banging on his chest in his office like Matthew McConaughey in Wolf of Wall Street.
I jerk off at least twice a day.
And one boss fight later on even manages to throw in references to both Metal Gear Solid's VR missions and Wolfenstein 3D. There's a whole car chase sequence that reminded me of something out of Virtua Cop, and just like Virtua Cop, there was a level soon after that on a cruise ship. There's even a section where you're sniping fashion crimes on a runway from a nearby rooftop, and look, whether or not this was intentional, I couldn't help but have flashbacks to playing Silent Scope in the arcades, taking me back to the days when I was a pimply-faced teenager doped out on sugary drinks. It's definitely a game embracing its meme status and trying to stay self-aware, and look, I'd rather play something like that in comparison to a game that takes itself way too seriously and thinks gritty and edgy just means covering the screen in as many blood decals as possible. Having said that though, when it comes to how the whole thing plays, it's still your pretty run-of-the-mill generic first-person shooter in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to the movement controls. And it is almost kind of odd to play an indie shooter these days that's got no dash move, no slide, no ledge grappling, or any of that shit. Seems like kind of a faux pas these days to not include at least one of these mechanics. But nah man, this is about as old school as it gets. Simply getting around with a high movement speed and avoiding projectile-based enemies. And there's quite a few enemies in the game too, all based off so-called fashion crimes. And then despite dealing with them by the dozens, the whole thing just completely lacks violence and gore. You know, unless you think it's violent shooting someone with a sewing machine, I suppose, or whipping them in the face with a belt. Even the health and the armor pickups are pretty innocent, replaced with mocktails and swag. And you don't even die in the game either. Instead, if your health is knocked down, you're just worn out. Now, all the weapons in this game, despite there only being 5 of them, are designed to be used specifically against all the various fashion offenders throughout the city. And thankfully there's pretty fast weapon swapping here, so you don't find yourself having to bug around with switching weapons in the middle of combat. Your starting weapon is what's basically an automatic shotgun. Just take a jackhammer or an AA-12 and fill it full of paint, and that's what you're getting. It also kind of reminds me of Homer's makeup gun from The Simpsons.
And now you're ready for a night on the town.
It's called the To Die For Carbon Elite, which I didn't understand at first when I read it, but as soon as you say that out loud, it makes perfect sense. And this thing's primarily used for shooting colour back into enemies wearing dull outfits. Guys who kinda look and sound like the agents from The Matrix. Then ironically, it's got an alternate fire mode which sucks the colour out of something. Used against people wearing outfits so bright that they may as well be a goddamn solar flare. You'll use this the most against these douchebags zipping around on scooters, which have to be one of the most annoying enemies in the entire game. Yeah, and it seems the level designer was fond of putting them around corners and in small rooms too. Yeah, thanks. It's just kind of like they've been put there to be as annoying as possible. I mean, I can't think of any other reason why you'd put one of these guys behind a closed door, you know, unless you were intentionally trying to piss me off. Anyway, this alternate fire mode is also used for sucking the colour out of fire hydrants, about as quickly as your mother can suck a melon through a garden hose, which has the added benefit of then powering up the carbine to shoot in burst fire mode. After that, you've got an old school sewing machine which has been weaponized and turned into an assault rifle, rapidly firing out sewing pins, which can improve the fit on loose or tight fitting business suits. Yeah, alright, that makes sense.
This. Ouch! Oh, I'm sorry. Did my pen get in the way of your ass?
Yeah, I can't say that I ever expected to see a sewing machine as a weapon in a video game, but hey, here we are. Plus, it's used against one of the other super annoying enemies, which are the Karens. Yeah, annoying bitches that hover around in the air wearing potato sacks and asking to speak to the manager. Because yeah, man, that meme totally hasn't been played out yet.
Try me, bitch.
All whilst leaving behind these harmful clouds of pepper spray? Yeah? Alright, let's call it pepper spray. Now, along with my dislike for just how overused that Karen meme is, I have to say that again, like the guys on scooters, these enemies are just not that fun to fight, leaving those clouds behind them for what feels like an eternity. And then later on, you'll use the sewing machine against these faster moving Wall Street yuppie type enemies, who dash all over the place like they've spent far too much time in the old Peruvian marching powder. And look, it's not like these guys are that hard either, it's just that they're so mobile and fast that it really makes dealing with them an absolute chore. You've got to wait until they stand still to hit them with the sewing machine's alternate fire, which wraps them up in a bag. No, not that kind of bag. At which point you can finally lay into them harder than the IRS does. There's a challenge map where you've got to take on at least a dozen if not more at once, and to say that this fight is needlessly overwhelming is just underselling it. And it is a bit of a shame too that this alternate attack doesn't work against the other enemies. I mean, it would have really given the combat some much needed crowd control options. Considering really the only kind of crowd control you've got is the belt. Yeah, at any time if you press that shift button, you can take your belt off like you're an abusive stepfather and then just start whipping people in the face.
Hey. Man, Pooty done did it again!
Charged up attack is supposed to stun a group of enemies, but I found the charge time a bit too long here, so I pretty much just found myself using it against single enemies, which I thought was more effective. What it's mainly used for is against these enemies walking around with their pants around their ankles. Man, I sound like such a boomer saying that. And yeah, did I mention too, these guys fire out vape rings at the player to damage them. I do think it's nice though that the game lets you redeem vapors by making them see the errors of their ways. You know, considering that most of these people in real life don't realise yet how fucking dumb they look. But the belt also plays a big part in the platforming because you're going to spend a hell of a lot of time here swinging from more poles than your mother does on a Saturday night. Yeah, wow, 2 your mum jokes in a single video. It's a record.
Shake it, baby.
Often swinging across these bottomless pits, snapping to conveniently placed flagpoles over and over. Only, don't fear, because if you happen to fall, and you definitely will fall, you just start right back up again from the nearest ledge. Why do I say that you're gonna definitely fall here? Well, because the belt kind of seems a bit inconsistent. I mean, sometimes it gives you a heap of forward momentum, but then other times it doesn't. And even after finishing the entire game, I still felt like I hadn't got the handle of how this thing works. Where was I again? Yeah, the weapons. Okay, right. So after the sewing machine gun and the belt, you've got what's more or less a water gun filled with soap. And it turns out this one has the ability to also shrink baggy suits if, you know, shooting with the sewing machine isn't exactly your cup of tea. This thing's primary use though is against one of the tougher enemy types, the Flamer, who, true to his namesake, can shoot out fireballs in a bunch of different ways. He's kinda like the Archvile from Doom, just without the ability to resurrect enemies, also without the pants shitting associated with coming across one of them.
Fuck this.
It's also an enemy that I'm almost embarrassed to admit hit a bit too close to home for me. You know, at the risk of making me show my age a little bit, it really does remind me of that time period back in the late 90s, when clothing with fire graphics on it really was the rage. And look, I'm sad to admit that I definitely got swept up in and burned by that craze too. You gotta remember, man, that this was the era of spiked hair, and me, as a ginger, I was basically walking around looking like a human matchstick, and a shirt with a fire graphic on it, well, it certainly wasn't helping. Yeah, you watched this video for a surface level rundown on the game mechanics. You never expected to get a window into the rich tapestry that is my childhood. Didn't expect that, did ya, bitch? Anyway, this is also another weapon that you're gonna have to use for platforming, because spraying this thing in front of you as you're moving increases your movement speed due to the ground now being slippery with slope. Slope? Due to the ground now being slippery with soap. And while that's a neat idea, I can't help but see the downside to this, in the way that you constantly hold down the left mouse button, which not only causes the screen to shake, but also just takes up like a third of the screen with the weapon model. I mean, not exactly conducive to seamless platforming, is it? There's a challenge map which just has some downright sadistic sequences, and having to constantly hold down the left mouse button as I was getting through these really didn't do me any favours. Still though, I guess it's a fun enough weapon to use. I think the sprite work is good, and the alternate fire mode, aiming down sights like you're playing Call of Duty, offers up a faster method to dispatching the right enemy types. Next up though is by far the lamest weapon, and that's the sock gnomes. Now I don't know where exactly this idea comes from. I'm gonna take a guess here and think that it's a bit of a joke on how socks always go missing, and these are like the gnomes responsible for it or something? I don't know. Or maybe it's supposed to be a reference to that episode of South Park with the underpants gnomes? I don't know, man, it wouldn't surprise me given the abundance of other references in the game.
I'm not a pussy, you're a pussy. You're a pussy, pussy. Aye.
Like, did I mention before how when you beat the Flamer, his animation is pretty much exactly the same as Dalsim's victory dance from Street Fighter 2. Perfect. Either way, you mostly use the gnomes against annoying tourists who run around taking happy snaps. Tourists responsible for the most egregious of all fashion crimes. Wait for it, wearing socks with sandals. And this might be fine, only the gnomes are thrown, with there being a bit of a delay before they even connect with the enemy. The fact too that there also doesn't seem to be any real limit to the range the tourists can take photos from, and also the fact that you're often dealing with multiple tourists at a time, and yeah, you can understand how much of a mess it becomes. I just think this is really the only weapon that doesn't quite work here. I mean, look, the concept is fine in theory, but the delay before it activates, compounded even more if you're playing on high difficulties, just makes some of the combat sections needlessly tough. Finally, as you'd expect for a retro-inspired shooter worth its salt, Fashion Police Squad has its very own BFG, yeah, literally named the BFG, short for Big Fashionable Gun. And yeah, look, that's just so effortlessly clever that I don't think I could say a bad word about it if I tried. This thing's basically like a rocket launcher, and if you press the alt fire when the rockets are already launched, they're going to split off into multiple mini rockets, all having that much appreciated benefit of being able to instantly kill any enemy type. The only downside is that it relies on ammo pickups, making it the only weapon in the game to do that. And I can't help but think it would have worked better on a timer here, or maybe if it like charged up with each enemy dealt with. That's the idea they use for a power-up here, which I can only describe as bitch slapping the fashion sense into people. Yeah, hey Charlie, there's a new joke going around, have you heard it? What did the 5 fingers say to the face? Slap! That was cold-blooded! Now you charge this up by taking out enemies, and once it's activated you can zip all over the place, pimp slapping these fools and put them out of commission with a single hit. It works well as an overpowered ability which when timed correctly can really get you out of shit creek, and I just think that this approach would have really worked well for the BFG too. Because what it means is if you're going back replaying the old levels to find all the secrets, which let's be honest you're probably going to want to do, you can't use the BFG to make this process faster, because there's just not going to be any ammo for it at that point. And I guess that really is one of the main problems I have with Fashion Police Squad, is that the combat just never really feels like it's advancing. You encounter new enemies frequently, but it always goes back to the same method of dealing with them. If you don't use the right weapon against the right enemy type, then you get this big old fat X popping up on their health bar. People often talked about Doom Eternal forcing you to play the game a certain way, which was largely bullshit by the way, but this right here is a game that literally forces you to play a certain way and use specific weapons.
I did not pay $60 for this!
Because if you don't, you will do literally no damage to these enemies. Like, by the end of the game, right, despite having all these weapons and abilities, you're still gonna have to pull out the old carbine to deal with those guys in the dull suits. When you see those guys on the scooters or the guys in the loose suits, I mean, yeah, you can use the water gun if you really want to, but the carbine or the sewing machine gun are arguably still more effective. I also think it becomes a bit of a mess when you've got a bunch of enemy types on screen at once, because there's not that much of a difference visually between the enemies, especially from a distance, and it can be really hard to ascertain who's who. It's definitely at its worst during the more cramped in areas like on subway platforms or rooftops where you've got bugger all area to move around. By far the worst one is one of the last areas on an indoor ski slope, where the entire time you're trying to fight enemies at the front, giant snowballs are rolling down the hill behind you and pretty much at random. And short of just turning around to check constantly, which is going to throw the rhythm of the combat off entirely, you're probably just going to keep tanking these things to the back of the head like some kind of frosty donkey punch.
The Iceman cometh.
I think when push comes to shove, this is a fun game, but you can definitely tell that it's something that's only been made by a few people. I don't think that makes it bad though, and it definitely achieves what it feels like it sets out to do. And I could sit here for half an hour and rip this thing apart thread by thread, pun intended by the way, but you know what, I just don't know if there'd be any value in that. The vast majority of the time spent here is colourful, humorous and wholesome, and it's priced correctly too, coming in at about $30 dues, which considering the side content and the optional challenge maps I think is more than enough to keep you busy. Plus if you buy it, you're going to be doing your part to support indie devs, which, you know what, at the end of the day is the only reason I make videos like this to begin with. So drip and tear until it is done.